Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us again today for our webinar. Today, we are using evidence-based practices to amplify trust. That's our theme for today. We want to welcome our Blue Courage Master Trainers, Michael Nila and Jack Hart, and our cultural anthropologists. We have Ken Price and Robert Adams. Joining us also today from Temple University Department of Criminal Justice, Professor Jerry Ratcliffe. Thank you all for being here. Again, I want to remind everyone to please use the chat box, ask questions, and we will get to as many of them as we can today. Please reply to all panelists and to everyone. I'll now turn it over to Jack to get us started. Thank you.
Becky, thank you so much. And thanks so much to the Blue Courage and Thomas Leland teams for making these webinars a reality. It's much appreciated. And thanks to all of you for joining us. It means a lot that you would spend some time out of your day with us as we do this discovery of Blue culture, moving from pain to healing to growth. So welcome, everybody. Harvard Business Review had an article entitled "Culture is Not the Culprit." And the authors, Jay Lorsch and Emily McTague, reported that of the corporate leaders they had interviewed, they said that culture isn't something that you fix. Rather, cultural change is what you get after you put new processes and structures in place to tackle tough business challenges like reworking an outdated strategy or business model. Is policing an outdated strategy and business model? Thank you for joining us today as we explore current and emerging systems, including evidence-based ones that could positively shape police culture. Quick introductions. In his 50th year in policing, Police Commander Emeritus from Aurora, Illinois, and founder of Blue Courage, please welcome Michael Nila. An applied cultural anthropologist and senior engagement leader, consultant, and managing partner with Thomas Leland, please welcome Dr. Ken Price. A cultural anthropologist who specializes in diversity and inclusion, mindful leadership, organizational change, and strategic planning, please welcome Dr. Robert Adams, Jr. And today marks the 35th anniversary in policing for our guest, a former London Metropolitan Police officer, college professor, author, and host of the outstanding Reducing Crime podcast. He is award-winning for his evidence-based practices work with the Philadelphia Police Department in both foot patrols and predictive policing. And he is one of the best speakers and presenters I have ever seen. If you ever see his name in an IACP or an ASEBP conference, run, don't walk to that seminar, not only for the amazing content, but for his tremendous sense of humor. His last book and 3-day practitioner's course is called Reducing Crime, a companion for police leaders. Please welcome Dr. Jerry Ratcliffe. Hi, Jerry, welcome.
Hey, how's it going, Jack?
Awesome, thank you so much for being here. In the police speaking circuit, I think you're only second to the great Gordon Graham. And which I think is a huge compliment. There you go. I mentioned your sense of humor. So here's a line from your bio where it says, quote, "He is an instrument-rated seaplane pilot and also likes to scuba dive, ski, and drink bourbon, just not at the same time." Question, have you tried this to form that opinion? And if so, which evidence-based practice did you use to come to that quantifiable result?
Well, as this is being recorded, I will only confess to one of those, which is I have skied while under, shall we say, under the affluence of Incohol, and it wasn't graceful. It's definitely not recommended.
I love it. I love it. Very good answer. Very, very sound answer for posterity here, as it is being recorded. But Jerry, in all seriousness, you know, you worked with Chief Ramsey in Philadelphia, and I remember when he visited the San Francisco Police Department, and I vividly remember him saying, "The only thing cops hate worse than change is the way things are." So here you are bringing evidence-based policing, these gold standard research methods to a culture that is extensively, maybe almost exclusively, relies upon experiential knowledge, called in a recent tweet, the Cole standard. How are you able to connect with police culture so that you can shift it?
Well, that's a great question. I think when we think about what we do and why people join policing, I think everybody comes into policing with the hope that they're going to have a positive impact on people's lives and go home at the end of the day feeling like they made a contribution. I mean, we can't address some of the major issues in our societies. We can't do anything about unemployment. We can't do anything about poverty and all these kind of things in policing. But we can hope that the people that we touch in our lives and the people we try to help out, things end up a little bit better. You mentioned the gold standard. I think we're just trying, not so necessarily the gold standard, but just in evidence-based policing, trying to bring the best standard that we can. I remember police culture. I was a police officer for 11 years until I had a mountaineering accident. And in that time, I remember a lot of positives about police culture. But I think a tendency to take the approach of, well, this is tradition, this is our experience, this is how we've always done it. That's probably not one of the more positive aspects of police culture. So I think what we can do is use some of that experience to kind of say, well, look, here are some things that we know work. It'd be great if we could do more of this. Here are some things that we know don't work. It'd be great if we stopped doing this. But there's a whole bunch of things that we're not sure about. And we would love to learn from your experience what you do that you think is a great way for dealing with domestic violence or dealing with child abuse. But if it works, let's have a look at it, let's study it, and let's subject it to a little bit of scrutiny, because if it doesn't work, surely you'd like to know. Nobody wants to come to work thinking, you know, just discover that they went home and they were doing something that either didn't work or worse, can sometimes be harmful. But if we do find that Jack Hart has got some really innovative way of dealing with domestic violence that he's just been using based on his experience, if we can subject it to a little bit of scrutiny, there could be something there that police officers across the country, across the world could learn. And that could be something really great.
Personally and professionally, for ourselves, that we actually feel some meaning and that there's some tangible output and result for the work that we're doing that made a positive impact.
Nowadays, for a lot of people, that's the, you know, this is the majority, this is the main job that they will do. This is the most impactful job that they will do in their careers. And, you know, I'm a little bit older now. Thanks for the reminder that today was the day 35 years ago that I walked into Hendon Police College. But now I've been to a lot more retirement dues because I'm getting a bit long in the tooth. And you just see people with 25, 30 years in, and you just kind of, you know, they're realistic about the world in which they live. But you just want to hope that, you know, a lot of them kind of say, what would I like in retirement? I would like to leave the job in a little bit better sense, a little bit better place than it was when I started. And I think evidence-based policing is a way to actually really help people do that, to say, you know what, that idea that Jack Hart had, that idea that Michael Nila had for dealing with that particular type of thing, we've tested it, and you know what, it's better than how we were doing it before. That's great.
Thanks so much. Michael, I know you have a question for Jerry.
Yeah, I have a million of them. You know, in listening to you, Gary, I'm, you know, reminded of the great organizations today that often talk about failing fast. You know, that, you know, innovation, try new ideas, but place them under scrutiny so that you know what's working and what's not working, and then fail fast and shift to the next thing that, or shift to the improvement of it once you know what's not working. And I think that's one thing that we don't do certainly enough of in policing. I'm also, you know, intrigued by when you said, you know, a 20-plus-year veteran who wants to leave the organization better than they found it. I often find that many veteran officers in their 20s can be improved, and now they're just kind of waiting to get out, which is very, very sad. So here's my questions to you. You know, first of all, can you give us a very short definition of what evidence-based practices means? I know a lot of us throw the term around, but like culture, I'm not sure very many of us actually know what it means. And then as a follow-up to that, how can we use evidence-based practices beyond measuring training and strategy effectiveness to help us shape internal organizational practices and shape our culture?
Okay, so there's an awful lot in there. I'll start with certainly the question around what evidence-based policing is. Evidence-based policing is really trying to find the best kind of scientific research evidence that supports good practice in policing. You may have heard terms like randomized trials, and, you know, academics, we can use all sorts of terrifying terms that scare off most people. But it's really just trying to go a little bit beyond kind of opinion and guesswork to say, well, look, here is some evidence, here's some kind of scientific research evidence, not criminal evidence, that supports using this policy over using this policy. It's trying to go beyond just the kind of intuition, that kind of gut feeling that cops have, because across the country, there are nearly 800,000 police officers. And in my experience, they all tend to have very different guts. It's also about looking at, it's also about just questioning some of the policies and the practices that we have. It's the very simple question of asking, hey, why do we do it that way? As soon as you just ask that question, you open the door to exploring new ways of doing things. What was interesting, Michael, about what you said about failing fast is that one of the cultural challenges in policing, I think, that we have to overcome is a fear of failure. A fear of failure stops us moving forward and trying new things because we worry that if we just stick with what we've traditionally done, you know, as somebody once said, it was a great comment at a conference I went to, a policer got up and said, you know, you can fail in policing as long as you fail conventionally. And I thought, what a great comment, but also what a scary idea that it's easier to stick with what we've always done that we know doesn't work than to take the risk of trying something new because it might really fail. But that's how we learn. And we need to, I think about the culture within policing that we're scared of uncertainty and we're scared of failing. So we just sit back very much on tradition and how we've always done it. And there was a second part to your question, and I think it related to culture. So I think I'm sort of addressing that a little bit in this comment, which is evidence-based policing isn't just about, okay, should we do hotspots policing? Hint for those of you watching, yes, we absolutely should. Should we do focused deterrence? Yes, there's a lot of evidence about that. Should we do dare and scared straight? No, we shouldn't do any of those. But beyond that, there's actually value in thinking about evidence-based policing, certainly for you guys from a cultural perspective, which is addressing that side of that fear of failure, but also thinking about how we implement these ideas. There are some great ideas in policing, but they fail because they're not implemented well, because people don't understand the police culture and how to get these new ideas embedded into policing. And there's a lot of evidence of that in a whole range of areas. I mean, we still, for some reason, are using a QWERTY keyboard, even though it was originally designed to slow down people's speed of typing.
So very interesting. I love how you bring that up, especially about the ability and willingness and the courage, I guess. I guess that's why Michael talks about courage being the value and the virtue needed so much in policing, and that willing to take the risk to fail. I know in formal leadership positions, when Michael speaks to command staff members throughout the country, he will often say, what got you to this level will not get you to the next level. And yet what got us promoted, we want to do more of the same because it got us formal success in the department. Why would we change now? And it's that collision of narratives and that friction that often leads to what Jim Collins says about government, that we're 1,000 levels of no. And well, so I love that. Yeah, asking just one question.
Oh yeah, but I think what you hit as a really interesting point was eventually what happens is somebody gets promoted to a level beyond which their previous experiences are of no value. So if you think about policing, you know, as an individual officer, your area of expertise is going and dealing with individual incidents. Then as a sergeant, you supervise people who deal with individual activities and incidents. As a detective, you are assessed on your capacity to investigate an individual case. And then suddenly you're in charge of a geographic area of a city. And we're saying, congratulations, Jack, you are now responsible for the crime control strategy for an area that can have 100,000 people and 200 police officers in it, which is normal for somewhere like Philadelphia. But there's nothing in that previous history that prepares you for that, because you're moving from wondering about individual incidents to, I have to design a strategy for the whole city. And I really feel this is why I designed the book, Reducing Crime, A Companion for Police Leaders. Because I really feel for people. It's a bit like saying, we're going to spend most of your career teaching you about geography. And then when you get to the final test, it's a math quiz. It just seems a little bit unfair.
Completely. Yeah, please visit reducingcrime.com and check out the upcoming courses of the police commanders courses, please. It's a great place.
Thank you for the plug. That's another $20 I have to send you. I get it, yeah.
Ah, sorry. Yes. But well, the PhDs on this webinar, I think, outnumber the cops gratefully at this time. So let's turn over to Robert and Ken. Robert, I'm sure you must have some questions.
This feels so different today. The numerical superiority, you know.
Yes.
You know, so I think that, you know, we've been talking about evidence-based policing and this idea, but I also wanted you to kind of like think about or talk about ways in which you don't come at this just as sort of like for want of trying to find a better word, you're not just a bean counter. Your approach is both quantitative and qualitative. Can you talk a little bit more about how you, you know, peel back the layers of policing as you go about your work?
Right. One of the most underappreciated aspects of evidence-based policing is that it can be what we would call, from an academic perspective, mixed methods research. It's not just statistical and quantitative. There are qualitative aspects. We just completed in Philadelphia a couple of years ago the largest randomized controlled experiment in predictive policing that I believe has ever taken place anywhere in the United States. And one of the components to that was that we had some findings, but if, that showed that if you use marked police cars, not unmarked police cars, in high areas predicted to have high levels of property crime, you can actually have an impact on reduced crime. But one of the other aspects to it is that in the research, my colleagues and I did over 100 ride-alongs. And we didn't just learn about the results, but we understood why. So the quantitative results will tell you what's going on. The qualitative research may be able to tell you why and help you understand what's taking place. Because what we were able to learn from that is how officers feel about the idea that predictive policing and software is replacing their experience or knowledge, or they fear it is at least, and how they interpret their role differently because we're asking them to do something else. And that's a huge value in terms of thinking about how we implement different strategies. There are lots of great ideas in policing, but they have a tendency to fail because they're not implemented well. So you don't need to, in my view, you don't need to have a policing background to understand how policing works, but you do need to invest the time and the energy and the effort. And it's very indicative of some of the leading policing researchers in our field, in the criminology police research world. People like Jeff Alpert, people like Larry Sherman, people like David Weisberg, they've all invested significant amounts of time to understand the job. Jeff Alpert spent a lot of time sitting in police cars, sitting in meetings to understand what's going on. I learn more about I try to go on a ride along with every police department I work with where possible, multiple if I can, because I learn more. I'll certainly learn more on a ride along and in a roll call and occasionally in the pub having a drink afterwards than I will do in meetings with the police chief, because I can really understand the culture of the department by spending enough time with the officers to get some insight and understanding as to how that department really functions. The headquarters people can think it functions one way, but it can function very differently at the different level. So I think there is value in a whole range of different ways to bring your knowledge and insight and understanding to support the other pieces that go on. It's not just enough to read a web page that says this works and this doesn't. You really have to understand the organization so you can implement that change in a way that people are going to get some buy-in and you're not going to waste your time.
Thank you.
Well, thanks so much. And Ken, I know you have a question as well.
Do, yeah, and it's very much a follow-on to Robert's question. I think it's, we're applied anthropologists, and so what that means for us is that we need to formulate questions, hypotheses. We need to come up with a research design that has potential applications, and then we would like to support people through, leaders in particular, through a decision-making process, and then actually executing that in a group, in a community. And I imagine that you follow somewhat of an applied model similarly in your evidence-based approach. And so I was just wondering if you could give us an example of where you think that has most successfully moved from a design stage all the way through to an effective change on the street.
I'll take an example of problem-oriented policing. So there is research that, there's a lot of research. There's a new meta-analysis that's just come out. And just by using the term meta-analysis, I'm sure you've just lost 50% of the people out of this webinar already. But there's a new study that's come out that's looked at a whole range of studies that finds that one of the most effective ways that police can reduce crime is using problem-oriented policing. So I think this is great. We've known about problem-oriented policing for about 40 years since Herman Goldstein wrote his pivotal book in 1979. Now, the challenge with that is it's pretty much an interesting, either largely abstract or theoretical range of steps. It follows the scientific model, but a lot of officers I've had a lot of feedback over the years from officers saying, I get it. I read it in my promotion materials. I've seen the presentations. I get it. I've got to scan, analyze, respond, and assess. But the reality is that we have a whole range of people in policing. You're going to get a few at the top that just love academia. They're going to go get a PhD in the middle of the job and a law degree. They're going to study and they're just going to be fully on board with that. But the majority of the police department is made of people who care about doing a decent job and want to turn up. But they're not going to go and buy 10 copies of different books to really understand the nuance and subtlety of it. And most of those people used to give me feedback that says, I get the idea of it, but can you just tell me what it is the hell you want me to do? And so the reality was we have this really nice model, but the practicality is that people weren't really implementing it properly because it wasn't specific and detailed and basically clear enough as to what to do. So this is another shameless plug, I'm afraid. The Reducing Crime book that I wrote takes the PANDA model and adds in a couple of stages. But for each of those stages, it actually has a checklist. So as Jack kindly mentioned in the introduction, I'm an instrument rated pilot. So I can fly in bad weather in light aircraft, which is a whole character building experience in itself. But the way that aviation safety has become one of the safest ways to travel in the world is a combination of learning from experiences and developing ways to overcome human error problems. And one of the most effective, and you'll see this with pilots with 20,000 and 30,000 hours experience flying Boeing 747s, is whenever there's an issue, they revert to a checklist. Because a checklist is a design, it's been developed over time as a way to stop you screwing up and flying the plane into the ground. And so for the Sarah model, I took the Sarah model, I made a different model called the Panda model, but I now introduced into it checklists at each stage. Okay, you don't need those checklists for the super duper 1% at the top who are just fully on board and are studying everything and watching webinars. But for the majority of people who are in supervision roles in police departments, they're kind of like, I get it and I want to help, but can you just be a bit clear about what it is you want me to do? So each stage has a checklist. And that's been embraced. A number of police departments have started to use that, and they're now integrating that into their models. So Tucson, Arizona, for example, now use a number of those checklists. The New Zealand police have it included in some of their national documentation. So you're starting to see people use that because it takes an abstract idea, but that cultural learning, that qualitative learning that you talked about, Ken, now that kind of said, can you give us a little bit more specifics? Mm-hmm. And so the checklist is a way to kind of go, okay, here's what you actually have to do. And that's being picked up and embraced.
And so then the anthropologist might ask in the next point, so what findings have you seen in terms of the difference of having that checklist in terms of results on the street as opposed to what it might have been before?
Yeah, so they're working through those now because the book was only published last year. So those departments are working through those processes. And I think we're going to go back and revisit those and a number of other departments that are using it, because I'm very happy with the idea that it should come under scrutiny. I also like the idea of it being out there because if they want to chop it and change it and make recommendations for changing, that's how we learn and grow as a business. We've got to start to embrace some of the uncertainty. We've got to kind of say, you know what, maybe this could be done differently. And then let's go and try that.
I really love that you brought up the checklists. Speaking of Gordon Graham and Dr. Tony Kern just did a webinar probably 3 weeks ago on Lexipol, specifically talking about to err is inhuman and using those concepts from flight. I mean, and linking it to the checklist manifesto by Atul Gawande, and saying maybe checklists for doctors would be terrific, just like checklists for cops might be as well. But just to take it just one step deeper, in 1967, the last commission on policing before President Obama's in 2014 talked about, well, we should actually have 3 different types of people working for a police department. Police service aides, police officers, and police agents. And it's the police agents that are going to be the community building problem solvers, and that they will all have a 4-year Bachelor of Arts degree. Over-specialization in policing is an issue, and yet in our previous discussion, you had mentioned that some police departments are even trying to take people off the street and put them into specialized positions in police agencies without having to go through the academy and going through the field training process. What does the future of policing look like in terms of hiring and having people that are really good at 1,000 things or marginally good at 1,000 things instead of getting specialists that are really good at a few things?
Oh, wow. There's a $64 million question. If I have the answer to that, then yeah, that what you've really hit on there is a challenge there, because we are, and my most recent experiences with it, obviously here in America with American policing. Other police departments in the United Kingdom, for example, are experimenting with, and they've been around for some time now, community service officers. Okay, and community service officers can do a whole range of police activities, but not all of them. And I think the main appeal for local authorities in that area is that they are cheaper. So underlying all of this is that we're in an interesting place in policing nationally and probably internationally at this point in time, because there is a lot of scrutiny of policing and the skill sets of policing, and a recognition that there are some aspects of policing that police departments and police officers are not necessarily super skilled at. Mental health services, homelessness, truancy, some of the more social side of things. The challenge is that the debate at the moment is very much around, let's defund the police department and build up these other areas. But if you don't recall, you guys are obviously way too young. Well, sorry, maybe not, Michael, don't take it personally. But what we have is, recalling back to the 50s and the 60s, deinstitutionalization on the mental health side. The idea that level of treatment was going to be picked up by the community, but it never was. And so it wasn't a case of all of that money went to the police department, therefore we should take that money away from the police department. What happens is all that money went into the general coffers, or people wanted to pay fewer taxes. And now don't get me wrong, I absolutely love it living in this country, and this country has been nothing but good to me. But one of the things I have discovered is that here in America, we do like the idea of having services, but we're not necessarily that enthusiastic about paying for them. And I think the challenge that we're going to have is that there is a desire for specialization, because we want the best service we can. But whenever you specialize, it's going to increase the costs. Because if Jack is a police officer who is working the streets, you go and deal with a mental health incident or a behavioral health crisis that somebody's in. Once you finish with that, when you finish, you go off and can do something else. You can go and patrol, you can go and report a robbery, you can go and report a burglary. When you've got mental health service workers who are specialized in that job and that alone, when they're not doing that, they're sitting around costing you money, not doing anything. So I worry that this balance of specialization is how specialized you want people to be. And if you do, that's great, but are you prepared to pay for that? Because a level of specialization for dealing with people, for social work experience who've got mental health, for dealing with people who've got mental health issues, isn't just a 2-hour course as part of your annual training, as part of your post-certification. It's a lot more to it than that, to be at a level that's increased, that we can start to offset some of the issues that the country is currently concerned with. And I'm not entirely sure it's going to fix all of those problems. It's not for nothing that social work itself has come under a lot of scrutiny, racial issues around decision-making in social work, around mental health, factors as well. So I think we're in I haven't got an answer for you, but I do know that we're in very challenging and interesting times. It's probably not the answer you're looking for, right?
It's the big struggle, that's for sure.
Yeah.
Michael, I know you have a follow-up.
Well, I just have a comment. Yes, I was a cop on the street when we opened up all our doors in our mental institutions and stopped funding mental health care, which immediately created the homeless problem that we didn't have prior to that. But here's my question. With the current focus on evidence-based policing, the question of the day seems to be, with new ideas, how do you know what works? We're often asked that question in Blue Courage. What is the role of intuition, deep experience, and creativity in coming up with new strategies that should be tried? However, there's no evidence to support that they might work. Blue Courage is a great example of this, by the way. We built it really on our experience, our knowledge, education, and what we believe policing needed, with no evidence that any of it would work. Now, obviously, in year 3, we started doing the research to measure impact, but prior to that, we didn't know. So what is there, or is there a role for intuition and creativity and experience, without saying no, because we don't know that it works?
Oh, can you imagine policing without intuition, creativity, and experience? It would be disastrous.
Yes.
I think that, for your Blue Courage program and other programs as well, I think we definitely need these kind of things. You know, you build up these ideas either inductively or deductively from either, you know, here's a theoretical idea. So from this theory, let's try this because it might work based on this theory. Or you go the reverse. You say, I'm starting to see a lot of these issues in the data. Maybe this is what's happening. Let's try this as a result. So I think there is definitely these mechanisms that we can start to explore and say, okay, let's look through these different mechanisms, either inductively or deductively, and let's think about what are the things that we want to test. You know, I think there's a big difference between, you know, a cop with 6 months on the job going, oh, I have an idea, and, you know, a bunch of people sitting around the room, look, we had this idea, we've got collectively, you know, hundreds of years of experience, and we started doing it this way. Can we now look at this in a more robust scientific approach? And I think both of those are viable, but I certainly think the second one is the one that you would get researchers interested in. And what I really think is that what I mean, there are a lot of people out there just kind of, I'm doing some training, I'm doing this, that, and the other, but really robust people who have got solid ideas don't mind opening them up to scrutiny. And at the very least, I admire anybody who does that, because there's that willingness to fail. But in failing, we learn and we incrementally move forward. So, you know, it's how you approach and think about failure from an evidence-based policing perspective that defines how you feel about this business. A really good example, and I might get the numbers slightly wrong here, but a lot of people have got Dyson vacuum cleaners. I have. Anybody else? Okay. Robert has, and yeah, so we got these Dyson vacuum cleaners. Okay, now, Mr. Dyson, congratulations. Sir James Dyson, I believe, is a billionaire at this point, but it didn't happen overnight. The very first version that he sells, that he sold commercially, was his prototype number 5,126 or 27, I believe, which means arguably he failed 5,126 times. But the reality is each time he failed, he learned something. So there are many ways to do things, and that's an incremental learning model where, oh, that didn't work, let's tweak it. That didn't work, let's tweak it. That didn't work, let's tweak it. But if we're not prepared to subject what we do to a little bit of scrutiny, we really don't learn, and we're stuck with, that's how we've always done it. Now, that being said, I would go the other way that, you know, if people don't want to subject some of their stuff to scrutiny, I understand it. You have to be cognizant of the politics of what's going on in the police department. At the moment, right now, it's pretty chaotic in policing, and you've got police chiefs around the country pretty much not unreasonably kind of going, oh shit, let's just do something. You know, let's do that, let's do that. Let's seem to be doing something to address the crisis. And I completely get it. So you need to be in a reasonable mindset, because, you know, let's not subject to this to scrutiny. Right at this moment, I don't need to be seen to be failing at something. But when things calm down a little bit, I think we can move back to a situation where progressive-minded, and I don't mean that in a political sense, I mean that in a moving the field forward sense, thoughtful police leadership might open up some of these ideas to scrutiny, because that's where the ideas come from. The kind of rule I had with Chuck Ramsey when he was police commissioner in Philadelphia is, look, if I find something bad, I will tell you. But if I find something good, I'll tell everyone.
So interesting. David Lambert in the chat box asked a question. He said, how do we convince policymakers that we can try community policing, body cameras, mental health counselors embedded with police, et cetera, but, capital BUT, they have to evaluate these strategies as a matter of routine and not luxury? How do we work with the policymakers to, where there's a requirement, you know, or mandated? I liked even in our discussion, Jerry, you were talking about dollar signs might be the impetus to convince people that our strategies should be rigorously tested.
Yeah, so one of the, and I only got feedback afterwards, was one of the most, and this is not my perspective, it was given to me afterwards by people who were in the meeting, is that when we started the Philadelphia Predictive Policing Experiment, I, along with then Deputy Commissioner Kevin Bethel, I was asked to go along and speak to a room full of mid-level command leaders in Philadelphia to explain to them that we were going to do a randomized trial. and you're trying explaining a randomized trial to a room full of cops who had just been dragged in off night shift and are looking at you like, who the hell is this guy? With a weird accent and a college professor. I mean, all I needed was a bloody blazer with a patch on my sleeves, you know, just to fully buy into the whole image. But the reason I approached it was, well, look, everybody in the room is a taxpayer. And we're all paying taxes in the same city. And I live right in the heart of Philadelphia. There are 3 bartenders that I'm personally paying their mortgage. So I'm a taxpayer in the city of Philadelphia. And if we're going to bring in something that's expensive, I want to know that it's value for money. Because if I'm spending money, say, on predictive policing, I am not spending money on overtime in police hotspots. So if that's where I'm spending my money, I want to know that I'm getting more return on that investment of my tax dollars here than I am here. And when you approach it from that perspective, you can then get a little bit more buying, because that taps into the mechanism that everybody understands. Because like, we'll evaluate this, and if it's no good after 6 months, we're going to throw it out and we'll put the money back in here. And you can see all the dollar signs lighting up in terms of the overtime, understandably. But I think a whole piece to this is, one, is winning the mindset that we don't know if these things are going to work, especially in our town. So we're better off trying it and then potentially learning it doesn't work than just taking it on board and then being stuck with it forever. Because in policing, it's really easy to form a squad. Oh, we've got a vehicle theft problem. Let's form a squad. But it's really difficult to get rid of that squad. Once you've created it, that becomes a thing. You know, I'm in the vehicle squad. I'm in the robbery squad. Well, do we still have a robbery problem? It's like, no, but we can't get rid of the squad. The second piece is that, and you see this, it's not used very often, but I think some of it exists at federal legislation and it does in some other countries, is that after you spend a certain amount of dollars, I would love to see legislation, because this could be done at the state level. If the city send a certain amount of dollars on something, that something has to be evaluated. If you're dropping a bunch of cash as a city on something, I would like to see that it's achieving the goals that it was set out to do. And that's how I would like it from a taxpayer perspective. So I think there's a changing of the culture in terms of who spends the money, but then there are also potential avenues to use policy and a legal approach to actually mandate that evaluation has to take place. The city of Philadelphia, for example, spends $68 million on community crime prevention initiatives. Next to none of it is evaluated. These programs have been running for years, and we don't know if they work or not. Worse, some of them may be actually making things worse. We just don't know.
And then wouldn't that also empower the leaders to say no to things? Lewis in the chat box says, how do we deal with persons who try to be so open-minded that they let their brains fall out? Probably meaning that they say yes to everything or can't make a decision because they want even more data and data before making a decision.
Well, you look at half the politicians in the country and their brains have fallen out. So I think that's exactly to his point, spot on the money. Half the challenge is not winning people over to the idea of evidence-based policing. It's getting their heads into the idea that it's not threatening to them. I think when you explain it in a calm, collected sense, you know what, if we're spending all this money, we should evaluate it. But in the heat of a city council moment, you have to understand the kind of pressures that politician is under to be able to press the right buttons. And that's the challenge for police leadership, is finding the right buttons to press to activate the mechanisms that we need to be able to evaluate the stuff we do. It's a really good point. It's funny too.
Jerry, do you have any questions for our cultural anthropologists? You know, Robert and Ken are both using this time to really ask a lot of questions to be able to dig deeper into this culture and to make the shift. If you had a chance to ask a couple of cultural anthropologists or to help guide them in the right direction on this inquiry, what would you say to these two folks?
That's a good question. So I think it relates into this issue, which is, you know, and I think I said to you guys before, you know, have you ever met anybody in policing who didn't have an opinion? You know, pretty much policing is full of alpha males, and that's just the women. So what you end up with is lots of people who have an opinion. You know, they know how to solve that. They know how to solve, they've got all the solutions. And I get it. I was a young police officer. I hit the streets when I was 19 years old. You know, I didn't know a thing, but I thought I did. So, you know, culturally, how do we, I think the issues, and I'm not sure I have the answers now, but I think it's certainly worth thinking about in terms of evidence-based policing. How do we gently take people en masse to some degree to a place where a willingness to go, perhaps I don't have all the answers, perhaps exploring uncertainty and figuring out the answer to that isn't as threatening to my sense of experience and my opinion and my sense of kind of self-worth, almost that sense of culture. I mean, the whole of policing is about go and deal with things on your own after very limited experience, but be clear about it and be, you know, we don't embrace uncertainty. How do we change that mindset to find uncertainty? I'm not sure you have the answers, but I think that's a really interesting question to be willing to be for not just police leaders who can spend time in Gucci seminars and go to networking sessions, but guys who, you know, men and women who are just pushing a car around the middle of, you know, Aurora, Illinois, to kind of go, you know what, maybe we should approach domestic violence in a different way. And that's okay to try that.
Robert, Ken, any closing thoughts from you?
Yeah, I mean, it just reminds me that I think overall that you have to, it's the same thing. I think cops and academics have the same challenge, and that's to remain humble, to remember that the production of knowledge is really a journey of discovery as opposed to kind of like final answers. And I just remember being in a third grade classroom in Canada, and they were doing these little projects, and one of the projects fell over, and a little boy pointed out to the little girl that was doing the project, "Hey, that was a failure." And she said, "It's not a failure if you learn something from it." And I try to remember this
There's
always.
your Dalai Lama right there.
Exactly, exactly. So just that whole thing of you look for knowledge not as an end in of itself, but as to continue that journey of discovery.
Yeah, it's always hard to follow Robert, but I'm going to try. What just occurs to me, of course, it's a tremendous question, and there's not an easy answer to almost anything we talked about today, in my opinion, but I really love this conversation. What just occurs to me, when you talk about the experience of somebody, as you say, pushing a car, and how are we going to reach them? You know, how are we going to bridge the gap between the leadership and people who are on the streets, who really have to face the daily experience? To me, the key to start with, at least, in order to bridge that gap, in order to build empathy, which is the process that you want to go through, is to identify what is it that people fear, and why and how will they trust? And if we can answer those two questions, then I think we're going to be in a better position to bridge that gap and bring some of the really good thinking that may, you know, come, I think, certainly from your work, prevent it from getting stuck at the top.
Thanks, Ken. And Michael.
Yeah, I continue to be astounded at how much there is to learn outside of the police profession, from outside, you know, people who have never worn a badge but are experts in their field, and how they can inform us. And so, you know, to be open-minded enough to embrace these ideas, but not so open-minded that our brains fall out, I think is that humbleness that Robert is talking about. So I just continue to be amazed at what we have to learn from people like yourself, Jerry, and Robert and Ken, and so many more who have graced us with their presence. So thank you.
No, thank you. I learned a lot from this too.
Awesome. And thanks, Jerry, for your insight and wisdom today. So please follow Jerry on Twitter, who's a great follow and also helps by his likes and retweets. It gets us into the areas of who else we should be following and following this important conversation, not only about our own culture, but on making it evidence-based. And also at reducingcrime.com for information on his book and that police commander's course. And of course, his podcast, Reducing Crime Podcast. Jerry has some tremendous guests on and really talking about these concepts very deeply. So Jerry, my gratitude to you. Thank you so much for taking 3/4 of an hour to be with us today.
Thanks for having me.
All right,
Hey,
back to you, Beck.
Jack, can
Please, Michael, yes.
we have two great questions. One
Please,
from
yeah.
Nila about community policing in Chicago, and also one from Jose about how do we support the narrative that the majority of cops are good. I'll have our panelists take a shot at that, and we'll prepare some answers for that, because those are two very, very good questions.
Thanks, Michael. Exactly what I was thinking. Excellent questions.
Thank
right,
you
Beck.
all so
Thank you.
much for being here, to all of our panelists, Jack for guiding us through that session, and for Jerry. This is a lot of really eye-opening conversation that happened here. So very grateful for that. And as Michael said, we will definitely get to the questions that were asked. And I invite everyone who didn't ask a question to go to www.growblueculture.com. You can leave your questions there, or at info@growblueculture.com. Also a reminder that this has been recorded and it will be posted on the website. So please, you can go and see the recording there and any past recordings from previous webinars that we've had. I invite everyone to remember to register for our next session. We will have another one on Friday, July 24th. From the San Francisco Police Union. We will have Lieutenant Tracy McCrae. So we're really excited and looking forward to that conversation. Again, thank you everyone, all of our attendees, for being here today and taking your time out of your day to join us. Have a wonderful rest of your day, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks a lot.